You wake up before the frost has even begun to settle properly on the canvas above your head. It doesn't really matter if it's still night or just the early edge of dawn. The days all bleed together now. Somewhere beyond this stretch of snow-covered mud, the Eastern Front groans and snaps with distant gunfire. But your job isn't to fight, it's to cook, or, more accurately, to create something hot and vaguely edible from whatever hasn't frozen solid overnight. The cold is a living thing. It gets into your bones before you even lift your head from the old burlap sack you use as a pillow. You reach for your boots, which you placed under the stove to keep them from becoming stiff with ice. They're still hard as stone. You mutter something under your breath, an old village blessing, or maybe a curse ass. You stamp your feet into them. The stove is a field kitchen, a PPK-42. It looks like a metal drum on wheels, bolted onto a rusted cart that's seen better days. It's not exactly designed for Russian winters. You've patched the chimney with scrap metal. The stirring paddle is an old shovel. There's soot caked on every surface. It's your temple, your prison, your purpose. Today's rations are better than yesterday's, which says very little. A sack of barley groats that smells faintly sour, 2 small onions with bruises on every side, and 1 dented tin of preserved meat with no label. The last time someone opened an unlabeled tin, it turned out to be pig fat from 1914. But nobody complained. Fat is fat. Calories are life. You start gathering fuel, a process that now includes searching for anything that will burn without poisoning the men. Horse dung, bits of crate wood, sometimes cloth if it's too torn to use as bandages. There's no real firewood left this far from the forests. Everything's been stripped for miles around. You arrange the kindling with trembling fingers. Frostbite creeps in under your nails. The first spark refuses to catch. Eventually, the fire starts with a reluctant hiss. You feed it carefully, breathing life into the flames like there's something sacred, which, in a way, they are. No fire means no hot food. No hot food means men don't march. And if they don't march, they do, or worse, they retreat. And retreat is a word the commissars don't like. You pour water into the main pot. It's half ice. You have to chip it out of a barrel that once held diesel, then purify it over a flame, hoping the taste of fuel doesn't linger. Into the pot go the barley, the onions, the meat still frozen, like everything else, and a pinch of salt saved from yesterday. You stir, slowly, rhythmically. The steam from the pot begins to fog your glasses, though you stopped wearing them 3 days ago. They are too dangerous when they fog up and freeze over. The soldiers begin to trickle in as the sky shifts from black to gray. No sunrise here, just a dull change in the color of cold. Some are missing parts of their ears or fingers. Most are covered in dirt and snow, indistinguishable from the landscape. Their breath comes out in clouds. Their eyes are hollow. They don't speak at first. They wait, watching the pot. You give out metal bowls of barley stew, thin, tasteless, and hot. That's all that matters. They line up silently. One man mumbles a joke about dreaming of his mother's borscht. No one laughs. Another asks if there's bread today. You shake your head. Flour hasn't made it to this sector in weeks, maybe months. A boy too young for a rifle, let alone a war, looks at you and says, "It's not bad, cook." You nod. You've heard that before. He eats too fast, vomits behind the kitchen tent. 10 minutes later, you pretend not to notice. At midday, you clean the pot with handfuls of snow and a rag that used to be someone's shirt. The snow is gray with soot before you're halfway done. You write a note in your logbook. You keep meticulous records, even though no one asks for them anymore. It helps you feel like you still exist in a world that makes sense. Barley, 4 kilograms. Onions, 2. Meat product, unknown origin. Served, 93 complaints. None. Likely because complaining is a waste of breath now. The sun never really appears. Light just fades in, then fades back out. A medic passes by and hands you a tin of something. He doesn't know what's inside. You put it aside for tomorrow's stew. In the afternoon, You help repair a broken wheel on the kitchen cart. Without it, you can't move if the unit is relocated. And they say the Germans are moving again. You hear rumors from the infantry. Rumors of encirclement, of supply lines breaking, of entire regiments disappearing overnight. One man says the Germans have field kitchens that run on gasoline and produce real bread. Another says he heard they eat chocolate for breakfast. You say nothing. There's no sense feeding dreams. Evening comes quietly, as it always does. You stoke the fire again and boil water just to keep your hands warm. Someone asks if you'll make tea. You smile. You haven't seen tea since October. You boil nettles instead. It tastes like dirt, but it's hot. A soldier approaches. He's as thin as a scarecrow, wearing a coat 3 sizes too big. He says he used to work in a bakery. He asks if he can help tomorrow. He says he misses the smell of yeast. You nod, but you know there's no yeast. No flour, no ovens. Only snow, soot, and whatever's left in the crates that haven't been stolen or burned. You sit alone as the fire dies down. You write another line in your notebook. Men asked if we are moving. No orders yet. Weather worsening. Rations low. Firewood lower. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke. You stare into the embers, trying to remember the last time you felt warm. There's a sharp crack in the distance, not gunfire, ice splitting. The land itself seems to be giving up. You wonder, if the order comes to retreat, how long will it take to disassemble the kitchen? How many will you leave behind? Will there be time to even heat the water before the frost takes over again? The fire flickers, and for a moment, all is quiet. The wind outside picks up. Snow begins to fall again. You close your notebook and ask yourself the question that's been hovering in your chest for days. If the front collapses tomorrow, will there still be time to cook? The order to move doesn't come at dawn. It comes in the middle of the night, when the fire is nearly out and you're half asleep in your coat. A runner barely more than a shadow in the dark whispers the instruction and disappears before you can ask anything. You don't need to. You know the drill. Pack the kitchen. Be ready before sunrise. No explanation. No protest. You throw on your gloves, stiff and frozen into claw shapes, and begin to disassemble the only stable thing in your life. The stove is still warm, and your hands burn from the contrast between heat and ice. You drain what water you can. Some spills out and instantly freezes on the ground in a slick layer that no one will bother to avoid. The wheels creak. The axle groans. But the old kitchen still moves. A young corporal helps you lash down the chimney. He doesn't speak, just works. His face locked into the same distant stare you've seen on 1,000 others. His fingers are bleeding. He doesn't notice. Neither do you. By the time the convoy is ready to depart, the horizon has started to fade into gray again. It never fully becomes light. Here just less dark. You trudge beside the kitchen cart, holding on to the wooden handle like a tether to the world. Snow crunches underfoot. The sound of men coughing, boots dragging, and distant rumbling fills the air. No one sings. No one talks. They save their breath for walking. The new position isn't far. 6, maybe 7 kilometers, though the frozen terrain makes it feel like 20. You pass abandoned trenches, half-collapsed dugouts, and the occasional wheelbarrow with a body inside, covered neatly with a tarp. The smell of fuel and sweat mingles with smoke on the wind. At some point, you pass a burned-out tank. You don't bother checking which side it belonged to. It doesn't matter now. All metal rusts the same way. When you arrive, there's no shelter, just a stand of trees, their branches heavy with frost, and a half-dug trench that someone insists will become headquarters. You're told to set up beside a tree stump. Someone jokes that it's the command post now. Nobody laughs. You work without speaking. Clear snow. Unpack the stove. Lay kindling. Your hands are numb again, but you keep moving. Stopping is dangerous. If you stop for more than a few minutes, the cold creeps in and settles in your bones like a permanent tenant. By late morning, the fire is alive again. Barely. You boil water from snow. You open another tin, this one labeled meat jelly. Though what's inside resembles neither meat nor jelly, still, it melts. You mix in the rest of yesterday's barley and a few crushed biscuits someone left in the bottom of a sack. It becomes something close to stew. Maybe not in taste, but in temperature and thickness. A group of soldiers gathers without needing to be called. They appear silently, boots crusted with snow, shoulders hunched, eyes sunken. One of them carries a shovel slung over his back like a rifle. Another is limping. You ladle stew into their bowls, 1 scoop each, no refills. Rationing has tightened. Command sent fewer supplies this time. Maybe a mistake. Maybe they forgot you exist out here. A man with a bandage over his left eye thanks you. His voice cracks. You notice his boots are mismatched. 1 Soviet tissue, 1 German. He sees you looking and shrugs. Took it off a dead one, he says. Didn't need it anymore. The stew disappears quickly. Some men scrape their bowls with crusts of old bread, long gone stale. Others lick the metal clean, then return to their positions holes in the ground, mostly. Some sit and stare at nothing for a while. You wonder what they see. Later, a medical officer stops by the kitchen. He's bundled up like a walking mattress, his face hidden beneath a scarf. He offers you a tin of condensed milk and a cigarette. A peace offering, maybe. Or maybe he's just lonely. He tells you that trench foot cases are rising, that morale is falling. 2 soldiers refused to come out of their dugout this morning. One was talking to someone who wasn't there. The other just stared at the wall and cried until he passed out. The medic shakes his head, and they ask why the stew's thin. You take the milk, thank him, and say nothing. What else is there to say? As evening approaches, the wind picks up again. It never really stops, only changes direction. Snow whips sideways, slicing through the trees like tiny knives. You huddle close to the fire, checking the stove's hinges, making sure everything is secure. If the stove fails, the men go hungry. If the men go hungry, they stop fighting. If they stop fighting, you've already seen what happens. You write another line in your notebook. Same format, same numbers. Barley, low. Meat product, unreliable. Served, 87. Complaints, none. Some no longer have the strength to speak. A lieutenant stops by after dark. He's young, probably younger than you, though it's hard to tell under the layers of frost and grime. He doesn't ask for food, just stares into the pot for a while, watching the steam rise. Do you ever think we'll get out of here? He asks. You stir the pot slowly, deliberately. Don't know. You say, maybe when spring comes. He snorts. If spring comes, you both stand there in silence, listening to the fire crackle and the wind scream through the trees. Later, as you bank the coals and prepare for sleep, a single artillery shell lands somewhere in the distance. Not close enough to worry, but not far enough to ignore. A few men flinch, 1 curses, most just keep eating. You don't even look up. The night will be colder than usual. You wrap yourself in a blanket and try not to think about the hole in your left boot. You try not to remember the taste of real soup. You try not to imagine your wife sitting beside the fire back home, waiting for a letter you haven't had the strength to write. Instead, you stare at the stars, half hidden by clouds, and wonder, if this war ends, no one remembers the cook did the meals matter at all. The snow didn't stop. It fell in fine, endless grains, like ash, blurring the lines between sky and earth until the world became one pale, frozen silence. You had stopped checking the date a while ago. It didn't matter. There were only 3 kinds of days, now too cold to cook, warm enough to boil water, or so dangerous no one came to the kitchen at all. Today was all 3. The rations had run out the day before. Nothing remained in the crates but an old potato, half green and soft to the touch. A jar of pickled cabbage had frozen solid. The rest was snow and memory. You considered boiling your boots. You'd already scraped the leather once and shaved off what remained of the lining. The stew from 2 nights ago had used the last of the barley. You'd stretched it with biscuit crumbs and melted tallow from a rusted can marked 1923. You built the fire anyway, not because there was anything to cook, but because it gave the illusion of routine. Something for the men to gather around. Something to promise that, maybe tomorrow, something hot would appear again. They came slowly, wrapped in rags and smoke. Not as many as before. Each day the number shrank, like the scraps of food. Some didn't even ask for soup anymore. They just stood near the fire with their palms out, as if warmth were something they could catch and hold like rain. One man brought a tin and asked you to heat it. You didn't ask where he'd found it. Black market, looted, taken from a fallen comrade. It didn't matter. You pried it open, watched the contents bubble faintly, and stirred it with the tip of your spoon. It smelled like nothing in particular. He thanked you, bowed slightly, and walked off into the snow without saying a word. Later, an officer arrived with a letter. A torn, water-damaged envelope with your name written in careful, shaking script. It was from your wife. You opened it beside the stove. Your fingers trembled more from emotion than cold. Inside, a single page. She wrote of goats that had stopped giving milk, of neighbors taken away in the night, of frost that reached the ceilings. She asked if you were safe. She asked if you were warm. She enclosed a small scrap of cloth, a piece of your son's old shirt, to remind you of home. You didn't realize you were crying until the steam from the stove turned your tears to fog on your cheeks. A shell fell closer that evening. You heard the whine before it landed. Earth lifted into the air like a sigh, and when it settled, 3 men were gone. One of them had been helping you just the day before, scraping ice off the pan, singing something under his breath that reminded you of the fields outside Smolensk. You didn't know his name, only that he liked his soup salty. You kept cooking, or at least you kept stirring empty pots and boiling snow. When the food arrived, it came in an unmarked truck, guarded by 2 men with dead eyes. They dropped off a sack of dried fish, a few kilos of buckwheat, and a small barrel of sauerkraut that had frozen into a single sour block. You could have wept for joy, but instead, you just got to work. You made a soup with the fish. You added melted snow and sour cabbage. It was awful sharp, greasy, bitter, but it was hot, and it was food. They came back for seconds. You didn't ask questions anymore. You served with the quiet dignity of a man who knew he wouldn't be remembered, but whose work mattered anyway. A cook on the edge of history, feeding men who would never appear in textbooks, who would die in forests no one would name, whose bones would be covered by spring thaws and forgotten entirely. A general visited the next morning, not to eat, but to inspect. He looked at your stove like it was a relic, sneered at the smoky stew, and made a comment about the state of discipline among the cooks. You didn't reply. You just stirred. The men said nothing either. But one of them, the boy who had once helped you boil water, quietly handed you his gloves when the officer wasn't looking. He told you he didn't need them anymore. His hands had gone numb 2 days ago. You took the gloves. You thanked him. The war didn't end that week, or that month. You stayed with the unit through winter, through retreat, through reorganization, and through the spring melt when the dead finally thawed from beneath the snow. You served fish, stew, and barley, mush, and whatever else could be scrounged from collapsing supply lines. You boiled pine needles for tea. You roasted rats. You burned old floorboards for firewood. You became part of the kitchen, not just its keeper, but its soul. One day, a new shipment came, labeled supplies, real labels, marked with neat Cyrillic script. Inside were cans of condensed milk, sacks of flour, and tins of tomato paste. It was more food than you'd seen in 6 months. You sat down beside the stove and stared at the crates. You didn't open them for hours. You didn't trust that they were real, but they were. You made real soup that night. You added salt, onions, and a splash of oil. You stirred until the pot shimmered with fat and scent and memory. The men cheered. Someone sang. For the first time in months, you served food that didn't need an apology. The war would go on for years more. You knew that. But for one night, the fire was warm. The pot was full. And the men who came with their dented bowls looked at you not with desperation, but with something like gratitude. You wrote one final line in your notebook before sleep took you. Soup was good. Men smiled. Even if no one remembers this, I will. And as you drifted off beside the dying fire, the air still sharp with snow and soot, you allowed yourself one quiet thought. Even if history forgets the cook, the warmth of the stew remains in someone's bones. You wake up choking on dust. It isn't even a proper storm, just a restless morning wind pushing fine grains of Sahara sand into every corner of the tent, into your mess tin, your sleeves, and the folds of your shirt. You sit up slowly, boots still on, and reach for the water flask you keep tucked under your cot to keep it from boiling away in the sun. The water tastes of metal and heat. There is no time to complain. You've got half an hour before the first patrols return. The engine noise is already drifting in from the edge of the wadi, distant rattles of Brin carriers and lorries bouncing over rocks. You stretch your back and look around. The desert is the same color as your skin now, beige, pale, and burned. You trudge over to the stove, if it can be called that, a small petrol burner lashed together from spare parts and a salvaged German jerrycan. You fire it up and begin heating water in a dented billican. Tea is the first priority, always, even before food. You've learned that in this place. Tea isn't a luxury. It's ritual. It keeps men sane. It gives them something to look forward to in a place where everything, including the war, feels vague and endless. The rations today are the usual: tinned stew labeled meat, and composite and biscuits so hard you could hammer nails with them. You soak the biscuits in water overnight to make them chewable. Some blokes call it biscuit porridge. You call it the usual disappointment. You find a tin of golden syrup, half full and crusted at the rim. A gift from a passing convoy weeks ago. You save it for the tea. As the vehicles roll in, dust swirls up in choking clouds. Men climb out, faces pale beneath layers of sand, eyes reddened. The first question isn't about bullets or orders. It's cook. Is the kettle on? You hand out enamel mugs with chipped handles. One by one, they form a queue by the stove. The tea is dark, bitter, and scalding. No milk, no sugar, not today. They drink it like it's the last real thing on earth. A corporal tells you that he dreamed about toast last night. He says it with a straight face. The sand gets into everything, even the tins you've tried to keep wrapped. It grates between your teeth, no matter how careful you are. You slice open a can of bully beef and mix it into the stew pot. A few withered carrots, already soft and browning, go in too. You've learned to cut the mold off and keep the rest. Waste nothing. There's a smell now not appetizing, but at least familiar. Beef, tinned onions, fuel. A kind of comfort if you squint hard enough. One of the lads, Tomo, sits beside you as you stir the pot. He talks about home. He says his sister used to work in a bakery in Kent. She'd send him loaves wrapped in paper, still soft when they arrived. He hasn't had bread in 6 months. You serve out stew in battered mess tins. There's always someone who complains it's too salty. Then someone else complains it's not salty enough. You ignore them both. They eat every bite anyway. Later that afternoon, you try baking flatbread using just flour, water, and a steel plate over a petrol flame. It burns in the middle and stays raw at the edges. The men cheer anyway. It's not taste thereafter. It's texture, warmth, memory. That night, you lie awake listening to the sound of distant artillery and the rattle of tanks moving somewhere to the west. You don't know who's winning anymore. But in the dark, you remember something your old sergeant said back in training. Keep the men fed, and they'll follow you through hell. You whisper to yourself, we're already there. And then you wonder, how long can you feed hope on nothing but tins and tea? The desert sun doesn't rise, it explodes. By mid-morning, the temperature in your tent is unbearable. You've moved the stove into a shaded corner beside an abandoned truck, but even there, the heat curls off the ground like waves. The water you filled last night is already warm. There's a dead lizard beside the crates. You flick it away with your boot. Today's rations include powdered egg, canned milk, and something labeled vegetable protein loaf. You don't trust it. You've learned to smell first, eat later, but supplies are tight. You can't afford to throw anything out and out. When convoys are getting hit every other day, you boil water for tea again. The men arrive in ones and twos, dragging their boots through the sand, eyes half closed from the glare. One pours the tea over his head instead of drinking it. Another starts singing a pub song between sips. They joke, but their lips are cracked, and their shirts are soaked through. Breakfast is scrambled powder with a side of biscuit mush. You stir slowly, watching the eggs clump and seize into pale lumps. Someone claps. Gourmet, mate, proper posh. You roll your eyes and hand him a plate. One of the trucks in the column has broken down, and the crew is stuck 2 miles back. You load a pot of stew and a kettle of tea into a sidecar and drive out across the dunes. It's risky. You've seen what landmines do to wheels. But you go anyway. Because men without food start making mistakes. They greet you like a saint. You ladle stew into helmets and pour tea into dented flasks. One of them hands you a bar of chocolate, real one, somehow unmelted as thanks. You stash it in your pack, planning to share it later. When you return, the wind has shifted. A campsin is coming, the hot desert wind that blinds and burns. You cover your supplies with canvas, drive stakes into the sand, and seal every crack. The stove clings to its flame like a dying animal. In the storm, visibility drops to nothing. You huddle in the dark with a few others, the fire dim and flickering. Someone recites poetry. Someone else whistles. You boil tea, though no one wants to drink. It's the act that matters. The storm passes by midnight. Silence returns, heavy and absolute. You step outside to check the damage. One tent is gone. A crate has disappeared. The stove survived. You stare out into the black dunes and ask yourself, when the only warmth comes from fire and memory, how long before both run out? Word comes the next morning. The Germans are pulling back. A push is coming. The division will move out within 48 hours. You're ordered to prepare 3 days' worth of rations per man fast, transportable, and unlikely to spoil. You start early. You organize tins, boil water, soak dry rations, and wrap biscuits in cloth. You find a half sack of dried apricots, forgotten in the bottom of a crate. You divide them into tiny piles, one for each man. A sliver of sweetness in a world made of salt and iron. The men rotate through the mess area. You hand them parcels wrapped in oilcloth. One man jokes that it's his birthday. Another asks if you'll be coming with them. You nod. You always go. Even if you have to ride in the back of a truck beside the petrol drum, you keep the stove secured. You check the wheels. You tie the tea kettle in place with a bit of bootlace. Everything has its place. Everything has to be ready. That night, one of the younger soldiers, barely 19, hands you a postcard. It's blank. In case I don't come back, he says. Write to my mom. Tell her the food was all right. You keep the card in your coat. At first light, the column rolls out. Engines cough to life. Dust trails behind every wheel. You ride in the rear, beside your stove, looking back at the place where your kitchen stood. You'll build another one tomorrow, or the day after. Somewhere farther west, where the desert is just as dry and the men are just as tired. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find another tin of golden syrup. You hold that thought as the truck lurches forward and the kettle rattles beside your knee. Because in this war, sometimes the only thing keeping a man alive is the promise of tea. And you wonder, when the war ends, will anyone remember the cook? The first time they hand you a rifle, you almost laugh. You've never fired one, never held one before. You were a cucurille, cook before the war came. Ran a small trattoria near Frosinone, a place with wooden chairs and red oilcloth on the tables. You made lentils with pork, roasted garlic, and stewed onions so slowly you could forget time existed. People came from 2 towns over just for your veal ragu. Now, the trattoria is gone. The Germans came after the Americans bombed the train station. Everything burned. After that, you were rounded up a civilian labor conscript, assigned not to a weapon crew, but to a mobile kitchen unit supplying troops around Monte Cassino. Cook for us, the officer said in clipped Italian. We give you shelter, food, protection. You nodded. What choice did you have? You never fired the rifle. Instead, you stir soup in a battered tin pot next to a stone wall that once belonged to a monastery garden. You wear 3 layers of clothes under your apron. The wind still cuts through like a knife. Your hands shake from cold, not fear. Mostly, the Germans treat you like an outsider, but they don't interfere. You're useful. They don't trust you, but they trust your lentil soup. You boil beans in salvaged rainwater, crush tomatoes from dented tins, and drop in hard hunks of salted pork when the rations allow it. You cook with firewood stripped from trees that used to line the Abbey path. Now, the trees are gone. Only stumps remain. Like everything else, the soldiers call you Cook or just Cook. No name. One of them, young Pale, from Dresden, tells you about his mother. She used to make soup like this. He doesn't smile, just stares into the pot and says thank you. Another offers you a cigarette. You don't smoke. You take it anyway. They bring you whatever they can. Leftover bread, dented cans, and sometimes vegetables looted from abandoned farms. Once, a single red onion soft and starting to rot. You clean it carefully and save it for Sunday. It's not just Germans. Italians pass through too, conscripts like you, or soldiers from the puppet army Mussolini tried to rebuild in the north. They speak softly, eat quickly, and ask if you know anyone in Rome. You don't answer. You serve everyone. There is no Italy anymore. No sides, only hunger, smoke, and cold. The monastery above is still whole for now. You hear them talking about it at night, around the campfire. The Allies think it's a German observation post. The Germans insist it's not. You've seen both inside and outside the walls. You don't know who's right, but you know one thing. If they bomb it, everything around it will burn. One evening, you find a scrap of old newspaper and use it to wrap bread. On the back is a headline from months ago. Victory in the East. You don't remember what victory it was. They all blurred together. You wrap the bread anyway. You place it into a soldier's hand, and you wonder if he'll live long enough to eat it. The snow comes down harder that night. The fire dies early. You curl up beside the stove, apron still on, and think of your restaurant, of the smell of garlic on your fingertips. And you ask yourself, what does a cook owe to soldiers who only remember him when they're hungry? The wind came down from the mountains like it knew something. It had been days since the last real food delivery. What came in now came in handfulstins, dented beyond recognition. Half-frozen potatoes that went soft the moment they touched fire, and hard biscuits that you had to smash with the back of a knife. You'd taken to grinding them into powder and stirring them into broth. It thickened the soup. It made the hunger quieter. The Germans were quieter now, too. More officers, less laughter, less sharing. Men sat in small groups and talked in hushed tones. You didn't understand every word, but you understood the meaning. Monte Cassino would not last much longer. You stayed because you had nowhere to go. They let you sleep in the ruined carriage house, beside the field kitchen. The walls still stood, though the roof was half collapsed. When it rained, which was rare but cold when it came, the water pooled beside the stove. You propped your cot on crates to stay dry. The worst part was not the cold or even the hunger. It was the sound of planes. They came at night sometimes. Distant at first, low and slow. You learned to hear the difference between Allied and Axis engines. Even when the soldiers claimed you couldn't, you could. There was a rhythm to it. The Allies sounded heavier, more certain. Once, during a raid, you hid under the stove. Afterward, the wind carried the smell of stone dust and something else, something coppery. Blood, maybe. You didn't go look. Instead, you went back to your pot and started again. One day, a German sergeant appeared at your fire with a wounded man slung over his shoulder. The man was bleeding from the leg, a strip of uniform tied around it like a poor joke. They laid him down beside the stove. The sergeant looked at you and said, in thick Italian, hot water. Now, you boiled snow in your biggest pot. You didn't ask questions. The medic came later. The soldier didn't speak the whole time, just stared up at the beams of the half-roof as if something were written there. After the wound was dressed, he reached for your hand. Grazie, he said. Not in German, in your language. You found out later he was Polish. The war made strange neighbors. You began saving things, crusts of bread, clumps of fat skimmed off the top of soup, onion peels, not because you needed them now, but because you might need them later. It became automatic, a survival instinct. The cook's version of loading a weapon. Then, it happened. It was just after sunrise. You were outside the kitchen, trying to light the fire with a damp match, when the earth changed sound. It didn't start with an explosion. It started with pressure. A low thud, like something enormous had dropped far away, so far it took a full second for your body to realize it wasn't done. Then came the whistle. Then came the roar. You hit the ground before your mind could even form the word bomb. When you sat up, the monastery above was burning. You saw it before you believed it, chunks of pale stone collapsing into themselves. Centuries of quiet, shattered by a modern scream. Dust rose like smoke. The mountain wept marble. There was no fire in the kitchen that day, only ash. The Germans raged. Some ran up the hill, others wept openly. One young soldier screamed into his helmet until his voice cracked. You saw another walk straight into the woods and never come back. The fire was useless anyway. Everything was covered in white, not snow, but powdered monastery. A fine dust that coated the soup pot, your apron, and your lashes. You wiped it away, only for it to settle again. The sergeant returned that night. He didn't ask for food, just stood by the cold stove and stared at the empty pot. I saw books fly through the air, he said. You nodded. There was nothing else to say. That night, you opened a tin of beans and ate them cold. You shared it with the Polish soldier. He'd survived. He always sat quietly, near the stove, like a ghost no one asked about. He asked you a question that evening, in rough Italian. Do you think we will lose? You stirred the beans with the tip of your spoon. I think we've already lost. You said. You didn't sleep that night. Not because of the cold or the noise, but because something in you had shifted. Before, you had clung to your work because it gave you meaning. Because every meal you served, no matter how small, made you feel like you were doing something real. But now, you weren't sure. What was the point of a cook when the world no longer ate? And still, the next morning, you got up, brushed the dust from the fire pit, and started again. Because someone would come looking for food. They always did, even under falling stone and empty skies. You sat by the pot, stirring nothing but water, and wondered, when even history is burned to rubble, what does a meal mean anymore? The monastery did not fall in a single day. Not really, even after the first wave of bombs tore its walls apart and scattered its stones across the hillside like broken promises. The shelling continued for weeks. Explosions stitched the mountain like a cruel tailor, and fire rolled through places that had held silence for centuries. Still, you cooked, not always well, not always with ingredients anyone would recognize as food. But you cooked. There were fewer soldiers now. The front shifted daily. The Allies pressed upward from the valleys, while the Germans dug in along the ridgelines, building bunkers from the shattered ruins of churches and farms. You moved with the field kitchen, though. At this point, kitchen was generous. It was a single pot, one dented ladle, a cracked kettle, and a handful of beat-up tins rattling in a crate. You dragged it behind a cart when the horses gave out. You burned whatever would catch fire, olive branches, wooden crates, old doors. Once, a broken cello you found in a collapsed villa. You told yourself it had no music left in it anyway. The meals were simpler now. Soup when you had water, mash when you had potatoes, and broth when you had neither. You learned to scrape flavor from things. No one else wanted the gelatin around a pig's knuckle, the skin from dried beans, the last spoonful of grease left in the bottom of a meat tin. You cooked without comment, without applause, without even the pretense of pride. The soldiers still came. They always came. And they always said the same thing first. Is there any left? Some offered trade cigarettes, soap, or a spare pair of socks. You never asked for payment. You never refused it either. Once, a soldier from Austria handed you a small silver spoon wrapped in cloth. My mother's, he said. If I die, keep it. You kept it. You used it to stir tea. The shelling got worse. One morning, you woke to find the fire pit gone. A mortar had landed in the night. Where your stove once stood was now a shallow crater filled with blackened rocks and 2 shards of twisted metal. You dug through the ashes with your bare hands, found part of the kettle, found your ladle, bent but intact. You didn't find your coat. The Polish soldier didn't show up that day. You didn't ask where he'd gone. You sat beside the crater and watched the pale sun rise over the rubble of Monte Cassino. What had once been domes and frescoes now looked like an unburied tomb. The crows were louder than the planes. They circled constantly now. They were never full. That afternoon, a German corporal appeared with a package. From the monastery, he said. You didn't ask what he meant. Inside the bundle was a small loaf of bread, half a bottle of red wine, and possibly a head of garlic. You said nothing. You took it. That night, you made soup. You roasted the garlic on a flat stone beside the fire until it turned soft and fragrant. You added it to boiled potatoes and stirred in stale bread to thicken it. You used the wine for warmth. You didn't drink it. You poured a little into the pot. It was the best thing you'd made in weeks. You served it quietly, like always. Someone said it tasted like something from before the war. No one asked where the ingredients came from. You didn't volunteer. That night, you took a sliver of the garlic and buried it beside the ruins. You said nothing. You just pressed it into the soil with the back of a spoon. A monk had once told you that garlic was sacred, that it kept evil away. You weren't sure it worked, but at least it smelled like home. Then, one morning, they told you to pack up. The Germans were retreating. The Allies were coming. Head north, they said, or stay and take your chances. You looked at the field kitchen, the cart with its missing wheel, the pot still stained from burnt beans, the ladle with its bent handle, and you decided not to go. You had already lived through fire, ash, and hunger. You had already fed men who would not remember your face and cooked meals that vanished into history before they cooled. You had nothing left to fear. You stayed. You hid for 3 days in a cellar beneath a collapsed barn. You rationed a biscuit and the last 2 spoons of wine. On the 4th day, they found you not, the Germans, Americans, young, loud, smelling like oil and soap and something alien. One of them pointed his rifle at you until another, older one stepped in. They asked you questions you didn't understand. Then they asked if you could cook. You nodded. They gave you a can of beans and a sack of flour. You lit the fire again. You cooked for them too. Not because they were better. Not because you had switched sides. But because they were hungry. And because that's what you had done for years now, through bombs and hunger, smoke and silence. You fed the living. It was what you knew. Later, long after the war had moved north past Rome, past Florence, toward the rubble of Berlin, you returned to your town. The trattoria was gone. Just a blackened foundation and a few half-melted chairs. You walked the old path anyway, sat where the stove used to be. You brought a pot and you made soup. You weren't waiting for customers. You were honoring ghosts. As the steam curled into the air, you thought about all the meals you had made. The ones no one would ever write down. The ones that mattered only for the moment. They were eaten. You had no medals, no photos, no war stories worth telling. Just a spoon and a memory of garlic rising warm from the ashes. And you wondered, when the world burns down and builds itself again, who remembers the ones who simply kept the fire going? The rice was gone by the 3rd week. No one said it aloud, but you knew it. You could feel it in the way the quartermaster stopped giving precise numbers and started using words like adjustment and conservation. You saw it in the smaller scoops, the watery broth, the sudden interest in wild bananas and boiled tree bark. You were a cook in the Imperial Japanese Army, though not the kind anyone imagined. Before the war, you had worked as a line cook at a boarding house in Osaka. You were proud of your rice, light, fragrant, never too wet. Even now, in your ragged uniform and sun-scorched cap, you still reached for perfection in every pot. But Guadalcanal was not Japan. The jungle swallowed everything. Heat pressed down like a wet blanket, and mosquitoes moved in thick clouds around your ears. The days were a blur of sweat, chopping leaves for makeshift cover, and boiling whatever roots or greens the foragers brought in, when they brought anything. You were stationed near the Matanico River. Somewhere west of the airfield, the Americans were still holding Henderson Field. They called it. Your unit had orders to push forward, but the push never came. The officers gave speeches about honor and the emperor's glory. The men whispered about starvation. Your kitchen was a single rusted drum cut in half to hold fire, balanced on stones. The pot you used was battered, blackened, and had no lid. You covered it with an old steel helmet. When the rain came, the rations, when they existed, came in burlap sacks stamped with kanji and soaked through from the sea journey. Half the rice was moldy. The other half had to be picked through grain by grain to separate weevils. You did it by moonlight, squatting on your heels, squinting through the smoke. You weren't the only one who noticed. Soldiers began trading cigarettes for bowls. Men from other units, hollow-cheeked, silent, appeared near your fire without asking. Some had eaten nothing in days. Some had already started to steal. You didn't blame them. You would have done the same. Once, a soldier gave you a small tin of pickled plumber luxury item sent from home, probably part of a care package. You didn't ask how he got it. You cut it into slices the size of your thumb and floated them in soup made from boiled vines and bark. The sourness shocked the tongue. The soldiers almost cried. One night, an officer ordered you to serve rice for 50 men. You had enough for maybe 20. You added wild sago pulp and pounded taro root, blending it all into a sticky mash. The men didn't complain, but you knew they noticed. That same week, 2 men collapsed from weakness during a patrol. One didn't get up. You kept cooking. You had to. Because when the bullets stopped hand, they always did. For a while someone still had to fill the pot, even if it held nothing but leaves and salt water. Even if there was no salt left. You scraped the bottom of the last rice sack one morning and found only dust. The quartermaster looked away when you told him. You walked to the river that afternoon, caught a fish with your bare hands. A miracle. You cooked it in silence and split it 6 ways. The jungle watched. The silence was thicker than the steam, and you wondered, when the only thing you can offer is an empty bowl, what is a cook worth in war? The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decay. The relentless jungle had swallowed the camp, and with it, every hope of a steady meal. The once bustling kitchens had shrunk to a few scattered fires, where a handful of men tried to coax some semblance of nourishment from leaves and roots. You carried on, despite exhaustion gnawing at your bones, stirring whatever you could find into the pot. Every day, the rice ration slipped further from reach. Men grew thinner, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and deliberate, like shadows clinging to life. The officers spoke in clipped tones of perseverance and honor, but none of them offered more than hollow words to those starving. Your hands, once skilled in the art of cooking, were now calloused and cracked, but you still moved with precision. Each grain of rice, each scrap of food, was precious. You learned to transform what others would discard, the tough fibers of vines, the bitter peel of wild fruit, to something edible, something that could delay the inevitable hunger just a little longer. One evening, under the dim light of a battered lantern, you prepared a thin stew of boiled leaves and a single, pale fish caught from the river. The men gathered quietly, their faces etched with exhaustion and pain. You served them with a silent nod, watching as they ate, too weak to speak. A young private, barely more than a boy, looked up at you and whispered, "Thank you." His voice was faint, but it was enough. Days later, you heard the distant roar of artillery. The fighting had escalated, and the jungle seemed to close in tighter, swallowing the sounds of war and desperation alike. The soldiers grew desperate, their discipline fraying under the weight of starvation and fear. One morning, you found a man rummaging through the discarded shells near the firing line, searching for anything to eat. When he saw you, his eyes were wild, desperate. "Help me," he said, voice cracking. "I can't take it anymore." You had nothing to give but a piece of hardtack and a small bowl of water, but you offered it anyway. The man took it gratefully, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. The war had transformed you from a cook into a lifeline, a bearer of last comforts amid chaos. Yet, the question haunted you. How much longer could you keep this up? How much longer could food, or the lack of it, dictate the fate of men who depended on you? The jungle did not care. The guns did not pause, and the rice never came. The relentless struggle for survival stretched on as the days blurred into weeks. The rice was gone, the men were thinner, and hope grew scarce like the food in your pot. Yet, you continued to cook, to feed, to try to preserve some semblance of life in the shadow of death. The jungle offered little mercy. The heavy rains turned the ground to mud, and the mosquitoes bred in clouds thick enough to blot out the sun. Disease ran rampant. Dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion claimed as many lives as bullets and bombs. You watched comrades fall, unable to help but to carry on feeding the living. One afternoon, the word came. Evacuation was near. Orders were given to withdraw from Guadalcanal. The American forces had tightened their grip, cutting off supply lines and pushing the Japanese troops into desperate retreat. The small supplies you had fought so hard to preserve were gone, taken by the needs of the many. You packed what you could: a battered pot, a dented helmet, and a few tins half filled with unrecognizable mush. You left behind everything else: the ruined camp, the empty shells, and the memories etched into the scorched earth. On the long march through the jungle, you carried the burden of failure and survival alike. You had kept the fire burning as best you could, but the war had burned much more than just food supplies. It had burned hopes, friendships, and futures. When you finally returned home, the war was over for you. The rice ration was no longer a question, but the scars remained the hunger that haunted your dreams. The faces of those who did not return, and the endless struggle to feed those who remained. You never told many about the rice that wasn't there. The wild roots boiled into a poor substitute for a meal. The stolen moments of kindness in sharing what little you had. The quiet perseverance that kept a field kitchen alive in the heart of a starving army. As you sat quietly years later, stirring a pot of steaming rice, you asked yourself, in war, when survival depends on what little you can offer, how do you measure the worth of a cook? The first thing they took was your bakery. The second was your husband. He was drafted in the first month, when the Germans were still advancing fast, and everyone believed the Red Army would turn them back before they reached the Volga. You held on to the bakery, thinking foolishly that it wouldn't matter, that you would still bake bread and he would come back, that the city would survive. You were wrong. By September 1942, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a wound. Factories had become bunkers. Apartments had become barricades. The Volga River, once a route for barges filled with goods, now carried wounded soldiers and black smoke. The Germans bombed the city daily. Your street vanished in the first week. Your bakery, tucked into the bottom floor of a schoolhouse, was only half standing. But the oven still worked. The local party official found you 2 days after the bombing and gave you a job, not a request to command. You would bake bread for the city, for soldiers, for snipers, for nurses, for orphans. You would report to the district ration station and work under the supervision of the military food distribution unit. You said yes. What else could you say? The flour came in sacks, covered in soot. It was damp, full of dust, and sometimes small pebbles. You sifted it by hand. There were no eggs, no yeast, no sugar. The bread you made was not bread in the way people remembered. It just loaves made of dark rye, sometimes cut with sawdust or barley husks, hard as bricks and smaller than a fist. Every morning, you walked through snow and glass to reach the ration kitchen, a building with no windows and a wood-fired stove built into the ground. It was barely warmer inside than outside. You wrapped your hands in cloth, but they cracked anyway. People came in silence. Always more people than loaves. You handed out pieces like communion. No one thanked you. You didn't expect them to. The hunger made people quiet. The fighting made them distant. The children looked at the bread like it was gold. The soldiers looked at it like it was ammunition. The rations were precise. 250 grams for workers, 125 for everyone else. Sometimes less, never more. One time, a woman asked you to hold her child for a moment while she tied her scarf. The child weighed almost nothing. You felt its bones through its coat. The woman never came back. You waited an hour before giving the child to a medic unit nearby. The soldiers who guarded the bakery never spoke unless they had to. When a young boy with sunken cheeks and a strip of leather for a belt once asked if he could eat the flour dust from the bottom of the bin, you said yes. You watched him eat it with a spoon. At night, when you returned to what was left of your home, a cellar room beneath a collapsed building, you lit a single candle and wrote down numbers. How much flour was used? How many loaves were made? How many soldiers were fed? You didn't know why you did this. No one asked for it, but it felt like proof that you were still doing something. That something still existed beyond hunger. Sometimes you dreamed of real bread, warm, with crust and salt, the way you used to bake for the neighborhood. In the dream, your husband was there, eating, smiling. Then you woke up, alone, surrounded by ash and ice. Still, you baked, because baking was all you had. And you wondered, in a city crumbling one wall at a time, can bread hold anything together? The snow thickened in October. You learned to walk differently, knees stiff, body bent so your legs wouldn't cramp in the cold. The ground was a frozen sponge of soot, ice, and blood. Your boots, repaired twice with twine and scrap cloth, had started to crack. You lined them with paper, the kind you tore from old military notices pinned to the walls of the destroyed library across the street. At night, those notices flapped in the wind, as if whispering news no one wanted to read. The bakery's interior had collapsed further, but the oven still held heat. It took 2 hours to get it warm enough for baking. There was no firewood anymore. You burned furniture when you could find its chair legs, broken shelves, and the remains of piano keys. One day, a soldier brought a crate of German helmets, with cloth liners still inside. You burned those too. You never asked where he got them. The bread changed again. You were given a new ration mix by the commissar, gray powder made of barley husk, dried carrot scrap, and a pinch of flour. It baked like clay and tasted like wet ash, but it could be shaped, pressed into hard loaves. One soldier called it roof tile bread. You smiled at that, even though smiling felt like sin, because you were still alive, still baking. The new ration orders allowed for 300 loaves per day. You couldn't make that many. The mix didn't stretch. The heat didn't hold. The queue outside the bakery grew longer and quieter. People collapsed while waiting. A nurse passed out near the doorway one morning. You pulled her inside and poured her a cup of hot water. She cried when she tasted it. Not because it was good, because it was warm. The officers came less often now. Supplies stopped arriving from the other side of the Volga. The river was under near constant fire. Barges sank before they landed. One day, a flour shipment exploded on the dock, before it even reached the bakery. You watched it burn from the roof, white ash raining down like snow that had given up. The fire lit the sky like a funeral. That night, you baked nothing. You went home and slept on an empty stomach for the first time in weeks. You dreamed of apples. The next morning, a Boitwelf, maybe younger, showed up with a cloth sack of dried beet stems. He had frostbite on both ears. He didn't speak. He just held out the sack and stared at the bread you were slicing. You made him a small cake from the beet stems, barley powder, and snow water. He ate it in 3 bites and nodded once. Then he left. You never saw him again. The city sounded different now. The bombing was constant, but almost rhythmical, like a drumbeat. The Germans had pushed into the tractor factory and the grain elevator. You saw tanks moving through alleyways that used to hold bakeries like yours. The irony didn't escape you tanks, where bread had once risen. Still, every day, you returned to the oven. You mixed the rations. You measured with broken cups. You used your sleeves to wipe soot from your eyes. And every time a soldier reached for a loaf, you watched their hands. The way they shook, the way some of them cradled the bread before they ate it, like it was too sacred to bite into. You learned something in that even when a city is dying, bread still means life, still means memory, still means home. And you wondered, in a place where everything has turned to ruin, is the act of baking by itself a kind of resistance? By the end of January 1943, the noise in Stalingrad had changed again. It didn't stop, but it shifted. The thunder of shells gave way to bursts of small arms fire, then to silence. But not the peaceful kind. The silence of exhaustion, of surrender. Word passed through the bakery line like smoke. The Germans had been surrounded. The Red Army had closed the ring. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies. Planes still came, but fewer no end, more of them Soviet. On some days, they didn't come at all. You didn't celebrate. No one did. You were still baking. Or rather, trying to. The flour powder was gone. For days now, you'd been boiling water with crushed potato peels and dried lichen from tree bark. You pressed the thick, salty paste into flat discs and baked them over metal plates, like wartime pancakes. You called them bread because there was no other word. It was enough to quiet a stomach for a few hours. It was more than most had. The soldiers stopped asking for rations in grams. They came with their hands out, palms open, eyes blank. There were no more ledgers, no official tallies. The bureaucracy had collapsed, one page at a time. On February 2nd, a commissar brought the news. The last German units had surrendered. The battle was over. You didn't feel joy. You felt cold. More than 1 million men had fought and died for the broken city around you. Children had starved. Whole neighborhoods had turned to ash. You had watched bread go from food to symbol, from nourishment to myth. That night, for the first time in months, you baked something small, just for yourself. A disk of boiled flour and salt, pressed flat and crisped over firewood, from a broken window frame. You ate it slowly, in silence, no one else around. Just you, a flickering flame, and the memory of what it once meant to bake something whole. Later, in the weeks after the battle, survivors returned. Some limped, some were carried. You saw one woman walking through the rubble, carrying a pot like it was a child. The bakery reopened officially, this time with flour brought in from beyond the river. The first batch arrived in February, white and dry and clean. You opened the sack and stared at it for a long time. You let your fingers sink into the powder, watching it cling to your skin. It felt like snow, but warmer. You made loaves that week, real ones, crusty brown, rising with steam and breath. Men wept when they held them. Women knelt. One young nurse kissed the crust and held it to her cheek, like a photograph of someone she'd lost. No one asked how long it would last. Everyone had learned not to ask that. Later, the new party officials came with paper and pens. They asked you to give testimony for the records, to talk about the bakery of resistance, to write down your story so future generations would understand what had been done here, what had been endured. You tried, but the words didn't come easily. You hadn't baked for glory or revolution or the future. You had baked because the fire was warm, because people needed bread, because it was the only thing you could still do when everything else was lost. Years passed. You rebuilt the bakery, brick by slow brick. Some days, school children stopped in to watch you work. You showed them how to shape dough, how to listen for the crust when it's ready. You let them smell the steam as it escaped. Once, a girl asked you, "Did you bake during the battle?" You nodded. She looked at you, wide-eyed. "What did you bake with?" You smiled faintly. "Whatever there was." She didn't understand, not really. But maybe that was all right. And you wondered, when history remembers war, will it remember the hands that fed the hungry, too? It wasn't the rats that bothered you, nor the mud, nor the darkness, nor even the way the tunnels groaned at night, a low aching sound like wood twisting in slow pain. You got used to all that. You got used to everything, really. That was trench life. No, what got to you, what truly set your nerves on edge, was the silence. 50 feet underground, beneath the front lines. The war didn't sound like war. There were no machine guns, no screaming, no officer yelling orders across the mud. Just silence, heavy and total, except for the scratching of picks, the clinking of tin mugs, and sometimes, if you were lucky, the whistle of your kettle. You were a tea orderly. That's what they called it, anyway, back in the above-ground army. It was a secondary duty part-time work for a private who had a bit of experience as a cook or just knew how not to burn water. But down here, in the tunnels of the Western Front, you weren't just a tea maker. You were a kind of priest. Each shift began the same way. You descended the shaft on a rope ladder, slick with damp. A lantern swung on your belt, casting golden arcs across the packed clay walls. The deeper you went, the tighter the air felt, until even your breath made a sound. You'd pass the listening posts, little alcoves dug into the tunnel wall, where one man would sit for hours with a stethoscope pressed to the dirt, trying to catch the scratching of a German tunnel crew. Did he hear something? We'd dig faster, or set explosives. You tried not to think about that. Your station was near the dugout kitchen, a loose term for a corner of the tunnel, widened just enough to accommodate a table, a kettle, and a small spirit stove. The ceiling hung so low, you had to crouch at all times. The walls were slick with condensation. The clay sweated constantly, dripping down the backs of your arms as you stirred. You learned to ration carefully. Sugar was rare, milk was powdered, and the tea leaves, when you had them, were often reused. You developed a knack for stretching a tin of black tea across 3 or 4 brews. You'd boil water in a kettle blackened with soot, stir in the leaves, then wait, timing it, not by watch, but by feel. Too weak, and the men complained. Too strong, and they just looked at you, hollow-eyed, and drank anyway. Sometimes you added crushed biscuit for the body. Other times, a pinch of saltade, yes, but familiar. Some men said it reminded them of home. There were 22 of you in the sapper unit. Miners, mostly, pulled from the collieries in Lancashire, Derbyshire, and South Wales. Tough men with thick hands and quiet habits. They called you tea-lad, or steamer, or your favorite cuppa. You didn't dig. That wasn't your job. You made the rounds, pot in hand, pouring into mugs dented by years of work. You didn't say much. You didn't need to. Just the sound of hot liquid hitting tin was enough to bring a man back from wherever his mind had gone. You knew when they were close to cracking. You'd see it in the way they held the cup hands trembling, not from cold, but from everything else. The weight of being underground, the constant fear that the next scrape of a shovel might be German, that the next shift might never return. You poured, they drank. Sometimes one of them would tell a joke, not a good one, but everyone would laugh anyway. Once, you made tea with rainwater that had seeped down from the surface and pooled near the listening shaft. You boiled it twice, strained it through a sock. No one noticed. Another time, you brewed with water so thick with clay it left a ring in every mug. One of the lads, Murphy, from Leeds, held up the empty cup, smiled, and said, "Still better than what my wife makes." You made a pot for the officers once, only once. They didn't like the clay taste. You went back to the miners. They didn't complain. One night, while you were steeping a batch in the dugout, the walls shook. Not a collapse you'd have known. It was a deep tremble. You felt it in your stomach, more than your feet, like something massive had moved just out of reach. A German tunnel blast, not at yours, not yet, but close. The men were silent for a long time after that. Then one of them, Saunders, maybe, or Hayes, cleared his throat and said, "Still got time for a brew, haven't we?" You poured. They drank. The silence returned. Later that night, as you lay in your narrow bunk carved from the tunnel wall, you watched your breath mist in the air. You'd wrap the kettle in an old scarf, hoping it wouldn't freeze. You listened, not for rats, not for water, but for breathing, just to make sure you weren't alone. And you wondered, if your only weapon is warmth in a cup, how many men can you keep from falling apart? The ground was colder now, denser. The frost had crept in from the surface and settled into the walls of the tunnels. The mud felt harder, like clay turning to stone. The picks rang duller against it. Even your footsteps sounded different, as though the earth had gone deaf. You'd started brewing the tea earlier in your shift, not for efficiency, but because it gave you something to focus on while the walls breathed around you. The tunnel air was alive in strange ways. It shifted, sighed, and creaked in its sleep. Every once in a while, a sharp snap in the timber supports would jolt you upright abeam, adjusting its burden or warning you of something deeper, quieter, and much more final. One of the listening post lads stopped by the tea station that morning, face pale, stethoscope still hanging from his neck. You offered him a cup without a word. He took it, hands shaking, digging, he muttered, after the first sip. "Close, maybe 20 feet. You nodded slowly. German sighed. "Has to be. We've got nothing that deep in this section." You poured another for yourself and watched the steam curl upward into the flickering lantern light. 20 feet underground, between you and them. You weren't sure if that was a lot or almost nothing. The officers sent word, work quieter, rotate posts every 2 hours, keep steam to a minimum. That last one stung. You couldn't make tea without steam. You tried, but the men noticed. The brew came out thin, the heat faded fast, and the smell the rich, earthy warmth that filled the narrow passageways and told the lads someone still cared enough to make something hot. That smell disappeared. You kept brewing anyway, even if you had to put out the flame fast, even if you had to fan the smoke with your cap and stuff a rag in the kettle spout to muffle the whistle. You did it because the men kept digging, and you knew how they dug. On hands and knees, backs bent, ears always straining for sounds that weren't their own. T kept their hands steady. Their breathing is calm. One morning, Sergeant Fowler, massive man from Durham, with a nose like a minor S, shovel collapsed near the shaft entrance. His pick had snapped, and he'd refused to come up for air. You found him lying there, gasping, coughing up dirt and bile. You poured what was left of the pot into his mess tin and held it to his lips. Still warm, he rasped. Warm enough. He drank like it was medicine. You helped him up and handed him a biscuit someone had left from their ration. The only thank you he gave was a slow blink and a grunt. You knew it meant more than words. Word came from another tunnel crew. One of their galleries had collapsed after a miscalculated charge. 6 men gone. Just like that. Buried so deep they might never be recovered. You didn't know their names. But you made an extra pot that night. You didn't say it was for them, but the lads knew. They always knew. Sometimes you wondered why they didn't just give up. Why keep digging toward an enemy doing the same, knowing that whoever reached the other first would either set the charges or feel the blast. But then, what else was there? Digging was what they did, and tea was what you did. One evening, someone hung a string of tin medals over the dugout, stove old cigarette tins, flattened and punched with holes, strung like ornaments. They rattled when the tunnel shook. No one admitted to putting them up, but it made the tea corner feel like something close to a home. Just for a moment, you wiped mugs clean with a bit of rough linen and stacked them like treasures on a shelf made from discarded shell crates. You even tied a ribbon or torn strip of an old uniform blouse around the handle of the kettle. It was red once, faded now. You didn't know why you did it, just that it made the kettle look less like an orphaned machine and more like something sacred. You caught one of the miners staring at it once. Did your girl give you that? You shook your head. No. He nodded. Didn't ask again. You made him a strong cup that night. He drank it in silence, his boots steaming in the clay. Later that week, the ceiling sagged again. The earth shifted with a shudder that made every man stop, hold his breath, and listen. A single crack ran the length of the tunnel wall, straight through the tea corner. You marked it with chalk. The next morning, it was longer. You brewed anyway, and you wondered, if the walls come down, will they remember the taste of something warm on the tongue? The first thing you noticed about the uniforms was the smell. Not the smoke or blood you were used to those. You'd smelled worse in the city slums, in the alleyways where meat spoiled and drains overflowed. But this was different. Damp wool, rot, and sweat deep in the lining, laced with trench lice and old fear. No matter how hard you scrubbed, it stayed. Your hands were red from lye before the end of the first week. You didn't bother with gloves. They tore too easily, and the soap worked better barehanded. By then, your knuckles were raw. Your wrists bore thin blue veins like tributaries. You'd never been delicate, but even you were surprised how quickly the water ate at your skin. You had one barrel for boiling, one for rinsing, and a line stretched between two trees where uniforms dried stiff and gray under the smoky French sky. There were always more. Every morning, the orderlies brought bundles in canvas sacks, each marked with a name, sometimes a number instead, though many of the names never returned for their clothing. You learned not to ask. The worst ones came from the front. You recognized them before they reached you. Not just from the mud or blood, though. There was always both, but from how they were carried. Not tossed in with the rest, but carefully, quietly, as if still attached to someone. Once, a soldier limped into your tent with a coat folded over his arms. "Wash, if you can," he said in a thick Corsican accent. The bullet went through the collar. You turned it over. The hole was small, but the stain below it was wide and black. You didn't ask whose coat it had been. You just nodded, and you boiled another pot. The heat in the laundry tent was unbearable, even in the cold. The fire beneath the barrel crackled with wet branches. Smoke choked the corners and made your eyes sting. You tied a damp cloth around your face and worked in silence. You didn't have help. Most of the other women worked at the hospital tents or cooked in the kitchens, but they visited sometimes. One brought you a tin of sardines. Another, a broken locket with a photo still inside, found on the floor. She said, "Thought maybe you'd want something to look at." You kept it near the wash basin, not because you knew the man, but because it was a face, something clean. The lice were constant. They nested in seams, in the folds under the arms. You boiled everything twice. Still, they came back. You scraped eggs from the fabric with a bone comb and cracked their bodies between your thumbnails. You learned how to spot trench foot from the socks, how to tell which soldiers were sick just from how their clothing hung, how to tell which wouldn't return just by the stains they left behind. A priest once came to bless the laundry. You laughed, not to be crew-lit, just felt absurd. All this ruin, and someone thought a few words in Latin would make the uniforms cleaner. He waved his hand, sprinkled holy water, and left without touching anything. Later that day, you found a button in the basin shaped like a cross. You kept it, not for faith, but because it fit neatly into your palm. One evening, after a particularly large load, you were pulling a jacket from the barrel when it tore open at the shoulder, agate, charred wound where shrapnel had passed through. Inside the lining, you found a folded page, damp but still legible. A note written in soft pencil. "Tell Maman it was quick, that I didn't suffer. Tell her not to wait. The birds are singing, even here. I heard them." You dried it on the stove. You never showed anyone, not even the officer who collected the uniform the next morning, without a word. There was something sacred about the note, and the jacket, and the steam, and you wondered, if no one writes their names, who will remember the hands that cleaned their last shirts? By the middle of June, the weather had turned against you. The mud thickened underfoot, and even the cleanest uniforms came back, so soaked in clay that they had to be hammered against stones just to loosen the fibers. The river water, once flowing clean in April, now carried an oily sheen. You didn't ask what had been dumped upstream. You just boiled it longer. The fire under the barrel refused to burn straight. The wood smoked too fast. You fed it pieces of splintered trench crates, old rifle stocks, and even a length of broken stretcher when the supply cart stopped arriving. One night, you burned part of an ammunition box, ignoring the warning labels stamped in black. You needed the heat more than the worry. And still, the uniforms came. More now, twice as many, and heavier. You could tell the push was growing. Soldiers came down from the hills with eyes sunk deep into their sockets. They didn't speak, just dropped the bundles at the edge of your tent and left without waiting for receipts. Most of them never came back. Some began to smell of gas. That sharp, peppery sting that clung to fabric no matter how long you boiled it. It seeped into your lungs and made your head ache. You wrapped a wet scarf around your face and washed faster. But still your fingers cracked from the lye. The pads of your thumbs turned white, blistered, and then peeled. You no longer felt the difference between clean and unclean. Everything was just less dirty. You tried mending where you could. A torn collar, a missing button, a bullet hole that had not passed through. You used a needle as long as your finger, with twine from the hospital tents. The stitches were ugly, but no one complained. There was no one left to complain. Once, you spent a whole afternoon trying to scrub out the initials P.D. from a tunic knot, out of disrespect, but because the blood had made the letters impossible to ignore. They were written in marker, black at first, then red where the fabric had soaked through. You gave up and folded it neatly. The next morning, a young man not older than your own son, would have been took it from your hands, thanked you, and walked away. You watched him go and realized you didn't know his name either. You started writing them down. Every tag that came in, every number. You kept a ledger in the back of your tent, hidden between stacks of drying shirts and lice combs. You weren't sure why. Maybe to convince yourself it all mattered. Maybe because it was the only thing you could control. One afternoon, the shelling drew closer, not just sound, but vibration. The ground shook beneath your feet as you scrubbed. The basin rippled like a pond. You glanced toward the hill Fort Souville. Still, holding and wondered if this was the day it would fall. A runner arrived in the evening, barely conscious. He collapsed beside the wash barrel, not from wounds, but from exhaustion. You gave him water and bread, then let him sleep beside the stove. When he woke, he said nothing, just drank the rest of the tea you offered and left. The note in your pocket, the one about the birds, had faded now. The pencil had blurred from the warmth of your skin. You read it every night, just to remind yourself that someone out there had found enough peace to write such a thing. Even now, even here, you began saving scraps of cloth. Not whole uniforms, you couldn't do that, but torn patches, buttons, and odd bits of ribbon. You tied them together with twine and tucked them in a tin under your cot. A kind of quilt, maybe, for after the war. Or maybe just something to hold when your hands forget how to feel. One evening, just before sunset, an officer passed by and paused at your tent. "You've done good work," he said. You didn't answer. He left. It was the only recognition you received. And you wondered, in a war measured in shells and graves, does anyone count the lives held together by thread? The war dragged on through the summer, the mud swallowing everything. You no longer saw the sun. It was hidden behind smoke and clouds, smeared like a pale wound in the sky. Your hands had become a map of cuts and scars. The skin thickened, but still sensitive to the cold that crept into your bones each morning. The laundry tent had become a place apart from the chaos, a small world of boiling water, soap, and fabric. Men passed through silently, some only long enough to drop off a bundle, others lingering just a moment to glance at the worn quilts of patchwork you kept tucked beneath your cot. They said little. Most had seen too much. One night, the artillery fire moved farther away, a lull that was both a relief and a warning. You took the chance to mend a jacket with a hole near the collar, a hole that, by some miracle, hadn't been touched by blood. You worked by lantern light, your fingers steady despite their roughness. As you stitched, you thought of the man who might wear it again, or maybe not. The thought made the stitches heavier, but you pulled the thread tight anyway. The following morning, an officer stopped by the tent. He held the jacket in his hands, tracing the line of your stitches with a fingertip. "It looks like new," he said softly. You nodded without looking up. He hesitated, then added, "You keep them alive, in a way, more than the fighting ever could." You said nothing, because the truth was too big to fit into words. As autumn arrived, the Battle of Verdun showed no signs of ending. The clothes kept coming, each telling a story of mud, fire, fear, and fleeting hope. You continued your work quietly, without recognition or rest. The note you had found months ago was gone lost or burned. You weren't sure, but its message remained. One evening, long after the guns had silenced, you stood outside the empty encampment. The river flowed quietly, carrying away the last stains of war. You held in your hands a bundle of fabric, the remnants of the uniforms you had washed, mended, and boiled, knowing that these ordinary pieces of cloth bore the memory of countless lives. You realized then that survival was not just about escaping death on the battlefield. It was about the small, relentless acts of care, the washing, the mending, and the keeping of stories in thread and fabric. In a war that erased so much, perhaps it was the washerwoman's hands that preserved the most human parts. And you wondered, when history remembers the heroes, will it also remember the ones who washed their clothes, who held their stories in water and soap, and who stitched their lives back together one thread at a time?